A brand new 767.
Fuel pressure. Why would that be?
How come I have no instruments?
A catastrophic failure at 26,000 feet.
Winnipeg, Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Just lost both engines.
Holy cow!
I'm talking to a dead man.
How far are we from Gimli?
You're approximately 12 miles from Gimli right now.
I guess I'll just slip it.
The crew is out of options and running out of time. They're at the controls of a 95-ton jet that's quickly falling from the sky.
Mayday, Mayday.
In placid skies over central Canada, Air Canada Flight 143 is just past the halfway mark of its journey from Montreal to Edmonton, Alberta.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your first officer.
The plane is carrying 61 passengers and 8 crew members.
Beautiful day. Clear, temperature of 24 degrees Celsius.
It's July the 23rd, 1983.
There, that's coming along, huh?
Rick Dion is an Air Canada maintenance engineer.
I was going to Edmonton with my wife Pearl and my young son Chris, who was 4 years old, and this was the beginning of a 2-week vacation for us, and we were all pretty excited about going on this new airplane.
Compliment of the captain.
Oh, hey, Rob, thanks.
Whenever you want to come up to the flight deck.
This was my first flight on the modern 767, as the company had just acquired them.
I'll be back in a minute, okay?
I was interested in going to the cockpit to see all this new technology fit in with the work that I did on aircraft.
The captain on this flight is Bob Pearson. He's 48 years old, and he's spent more than 15,000 hours in the air. His first officer is Maurice Quintel, who has more than 7,000 hours of flying time.
Come on in.
Pardon me, gentlemen?
Rick.
I knew Bob Pearson from the small flying club that I attended in St. Lazare, and he was actually one of the local pilots there that used to do some gliding, and he also flew the ultralight lasers.
We had departed heading northwest, a nice clear sunny day in July. We're flight plan at 39,000 feet. There were a few airplanes that flew that high in 1983. And we requested 41,000 feet, which got us further above the jet stream out of the west.
The crew may have accumulated a lot of hours in the air, but very few in this plane. It's Boeing's latest and most advanced wide-body jet, the 767. An army of microprocessors in the belly of the plane automates so many functions that the flight engineer's job has been eliminated. This is one of 4 767s that Air Canada has recently acquired. The plane itself has only 150 hours on it.
Quite a difference here, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Reset on and start here.
The cockpit is different in that all the old instrumentation that we're accustomed to, mostly that was all gone. It was all CRT display, like small TV screens. It was a new high-tech airplane, which involved quite a change for the crew and the maintenance personnel, people handling it.
This was a new aircraft for both the captain and I. At the time, I had 75 hours on that airplane, so everything was new for me.
Pilots and maintenance crews are both still getting to know this airliner.
Well, then we get that same condition.
Captain Pearson explains to Dion how he handled a small problem with the engines on an earlier flight.
Comes back down to low stage, and we just carry on.
You know, that brings up an interesting...
Fuel pressure. Why would that be?
Whoa.
A warning alerts the crew to critically low pressure at one of the plane's fuel pumps.
Something's wrong with the fuel pump.
The 767 has 3 main fuel tanks, 2 in the wings, which are always used, and 1 in the center, only used on long-distance flights. Electric fuel pumps draw fuel from each tank and feed it to the plane's 2 engines. The low-pressure warning could mean that one of the pumps needs maintenance, but it could also be a more serious issue, a lack of fuel to be pumped.
That forward fuel pump. It's just a bloody pump failing, I can tell you that.
Another low fuel pressure warning sounds, this one from another fuel pump on the plane's left side. Pearson's flight management computer tells him he should have plenty of fuel for the remainder of the trip. The 767 also has separate digital fuel gauges, but on this flight those gauges are out of service. The warnings don't make sense.
It got a little more interesting when the second fuel boost pump light came on for that tank, which was the left tank.
This seemed quite abnormal, that 2 pumps would fail in a brand new airplane. We had some kind of a problem that we didn't understand.
What would your assessment of that be?
My own personal thoughts? It might be low on the left tank.
I used to be involved with transferring fuel, and I know that when you're trying to empty a tank, it'll start flashing periodically, and then the pump will reprime, and then the light will go out. In this case, it appeared to do exactly the same thing.
Captain Pearson knows that if the left tank is running low, the right tank may be low as well.
Let's head for Winnipeg. Now.
Pearson wants to land as soon as possible in case he is running out of fuel. The crew is still more than 700 miles away from their original destination, Edmonton, Alberta. The nearest major airport is Winnipeg, Manitoba, a mere 120 miles away.
We're showing lots of fuel on board our flight management computer and 3 normal fuel checks, cross-checked with our fuel on our flight plan. So we elected to divert the flight to Winnipeg, where Air Canada has a main maintenance base.
Winnipeg Center.
Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Ron Hewitt has 20 years' experience as a radar controller.
Yes, sir, we have a problem.
We're going to requesting direct Winnipeg.
Air Canada 143 cleared. Take position, direct Winnipeg.
You are cleared to maintain 6,000, descent, your discretion.
Send to 6,000 his discretion, and that was it. He didn't tell us what the problem was, and it's none of my business. Give him what he wants, get everybody out of his way. That's about what we do.
Okay, we're out of 410.
Pearson now begins to descend from 41,000 feet.
Oh man, we're all going out, eh?
The low-pressure warnings are spreading to more and more of the fuel pumps. Quintel instructs the cabin crew to prepare for an emergency landing.
Hello.
Cabin, we think we have problems with our fuel system.
We are diverting to Winnipeg.
All flight attendants to front galley, please.
I hope this is just false warnings. Rick, can you think of anything we haven't done?
No, I can't, Bob.
Okay. We've lost the left engine.
Losing an engine erases any doubt. Flight 143 is in fact running out of fuel.
Okay, checklist. Single engine landing.
Pearson is trained to land a 767 with 1 engine. No one has ever tried landing with none. He scrambles to get his plane down so that he doesn't become the first. With only 1 engine powering Air Canada Flight 143, and with the possibility of the other engine shutting down, the crew prepares the passengers for the worst.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your in-charge flight attendant speaking. Due to mechanical problems, we'll be preparing for an emergency landing. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Your crew is fully trained to deal with this situation, and as you may have noticed, some crew members have already started to prepare the aircraft.
I had no idea, like the rest of my crew members, that there was a problem with fuel. I had no idea why we were going to Winnipeg.
Approach and landing. Flaps will be 20.
Right.
Ground flap override.
As they're doing that drill, the right-hand fuel pump low pressure light was flashing as well, much like it did on the left. They were quite busy carrying out the first engine out, not watching the pump lights, which was right at my eyebrow, so I kind of knew that that one there was going to shut down too.
What was that?
Very shortly, we will begin giving you instructions.
How come I have no instruments?
Our beautiful colored engine and flight instrument displays simply went black.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Please follow our instructions. Refrain from smoking and put your chair back in the upright position. Secure your seatbelt tightly against your hip.
It's exactly what Pearson had feared. He's lost both engines. At 26,500 feet, still 75 miles from the nearest major airport, he's out of fuel.
Winnipeg, Air Canada 143.
Air Canada 143, go ahead.
Just lost both engines.
When both engines shut off, I think he said, "Holy, I'm talking to a dead man."
We were trained in the simulator to handle a single engine failure. We had never practiced, and I don't believe most pilots ever get the chance to practice total engine failures.
143 just lost their engines.
It's highly unlikely that anybody's going to survive this, because I could see them trying to make a turn and spinning in.
An airplane's engines not only provide thrust, they also generate the power needed to manipulate the plane. It would be completely uncontrollable, but modern airliners are like a Swiss Army knife with one last blade hidden away. In the event of a loss of power, they automatically deploy the RAT, or ram air turbine.
It's spring-loaded, and the propeller that drives this small hydraulic pump is about the size of a propeller you would see like on a little Cessna 150. And this arm catapults down into the slipstream. This propeller starts to turn, drives this hydraulic pump, and it gives you basic systems.
I was pretty quiet, flying without motors.
Pearson knows that time is running out. He needs directions to the closest landing strip.
143, this is a Mayday, and we require a vector on to the closest available runway.
143, we copied that all okay.
But the loss of the plane's engines has had an unexpected consequence at air traffic control.
They're gone. They were right here. We've lost him. He's dropped off the screen. I need primary radar.
Uh, 143, we've lost your transponder return and are attempting to pick up your target now.
We work on transponder, it's called secondary radar. We take the pilot signal to paint the aircraft.
Commercial jetliners are equipped with a transponder, a device that transmits coded information which air traffic controllers use to determine the plane's location. But when Flight 143 lost its second engine, only a small number of items got backup power. The transponder was not one of them, so the plane disappeared from Hewitt's screen. Flight 143 is somewhere east of Winnipeg, but no one knows exactly where or how far it is from the airport. In spite of its enormous weight, a 767 doesn't plunge from the sky when it loses its engines. Its aerodynamic properties keep it in the air, but slowly coasting to Earth.
and I was trying to figure how many miles we were moving ahead versus how many thousands of feet we were dropping.
But Quintel doesn't have the instruments which provide the information he needs to make that calculation. Since he lost the plane's signal, Hewitt can't give Quintel that information either. Controllers hurriedly work to rig up a way to find the plane.
Just before landing, you will hear the command, brace for landing. Brace immediately and stay braced until the plane comes to a complete stop. There are 2 ways to brace. 1, bend forward. Raise your arms and hands against the seat back.
Bryce Bell is a businessman on his way home to Edmonton.
As soon as they announced that we were making an unscheduled stop in Winnipeg, I immediately wished I hadn't had the 2 drinks that I'd had, because I thought, you're going to have a split second here, and this plane's going to explode in flame, and the decision you make in that split second will depend on how alert you are.
Okay, please put your personal belongings in the seat back pocket.
The response of the passengers when we were doing the emergency briefing was basically alert. They were looking at us. They were paying attention to every word we were saying. I couldn't have had better passengers.
I think that's him. Let's say that's him.
Because their modern equipment can't see Air Canada 143, the controllers switch to old-fashioned radar, which doesn't need a transponder to locate planes.
I got to turn up my true radar, the reflective radar, which is not nearly as good. And we don't use it at all if we can help it.
Okay, I got it. 65 from Winnipeg, 45 from Gimli. 143.
We have you at 65 miles from Winnipeg and approximately 45 miles from Gimli.
For the first time since losing power, the pilots know their distance to Winnipeg.
We might make Winnipeg.
Quintel, however, thinks that Gimli is a safer bet. Gimli, Manitoba has a decommissioned Air Force base. It's about 20 miles closer than Winnipeg. As luck would have it, Maurice Quintel trained at Gimli while in the armed forces. He knows it well.
45 miles to Gimli. That is a long runway.
Is there emergency equipment at Gimli?
Negative emergency equipment at all. Just 1 runway available, I believe.
And no control tower and no information on it.
Pearson must consider the possibility of a crash landing. If he has any chance of making it to Winnipeg, which has full emergency support, he knows he must try for it.
Okay, then we would prefer Winnipeg.
Fine. 143, continue your present heading.
We all reacted very businesslike and say something specifically to the situation, but never would we ever look at each other. I think we were all afraid that we might break down.
Parents were hugging their little kids, and people were busy scribbling away, which I found out afterwards where they were writing their notes to loved ones and their wills and all kinds of things like that. It was pretty nerve-wracking.
143, a question if you have the time.
Okay, go ahead.
Total number of persons on board, please.
The actual number of people on board is 69, but Quintel is overtaxed. He gives a lower number in error.
I have 33 people on board, including the crew.
Okay.
I have to ask if Soul's on board. I know he's busy. I don't want to ask him questions, but I have to. This thing can go down in the lake or the field. And I remember thinking, great. I know this airplane carries about 300 people. At least it's not 300.
It was about regrets. It was about things I hadn't done in my life. It was about ways I've treated the odd person here or there that I wish I'd treated more gently. It was about how stupid I was at some of the things I used to make big issues out of that are so insignificant when it really comes down to what real reality is about. It was pretty devastating.
And I remember telling a mother with a baby, and I had my daughter Victoria, and telling this woman that it was going to be okay. And I did it. I was so proud of myself that I could be so straight with her and tell her that it was going to be all right and really look at her in the eyes.
Okay, and how far from the field are we now?
You're 35, correction, make that 39 miles from Winnipeg.
Roger.
Now that controllers can see Flight 143 on radar, they can provide Quintel with the information he needs to figure out if he can glide as far as Winnipeg.
Roger, what is your altitude now?
8.5. 8.5.
About 8,500 feet above the ground, Captain Pearson can see his destination. Winnipeg's airport is less than 35 miles away.
We're visual.
But the news from Quintel is not good.
Bob.
Morris was calmly keeping track of our distance by input from Winnipeg Air Traffic Control and our altitude, and calculated our profile and came to the conclusion that we might not make the runway in Winnipeg.
We can last maybe another 20 miles. We're not going to make Winnipeg.
Quintel has calculated that at the rate they're falling, they would hit the ground a full 15 miles short of the runway.
How far are we from Gimli?
You're approximately 12 miles from Gimli right now.
Where is it?
Which way is he moving? On your right. Turn right to a heading of 345.
I would say you have 10 miles to fly.
Okay, fine. We're gonna go there.
I'm gonna go check on my family. You guys don't need me up here right now, huh?
No, we're okay.
Don't worry about it. It's okay. They got it under control. Just make sure your seatbelts are tight, all right?
When I went finally to sit down in my seat, this is where I thought, wow, you know, this is it.
Landing gear down.
Roger.
First Officer Quintel lowers the landing gear. Because there's no hydraulic power, Quintel does what's known as a gravity drop, letting the gear's own weight drop and lock it into place. The two main gear are heavy, they fall immediately, and two green lights confirm they've locked. But the nose gear is lighter, it doesn't lock.
We could hear the main gear clearly, falling and locking. I was not aware that the nose gear was not down and locked.
It was sort of a last minute, and if it's something that you cannot control, you don't talk about it, you don't mention it, you know. The main thing was bring the aircraft on the runway.
5 miles to touchdown.
Roger. We have the field in sight.
5 miles from Gimli, Pearson and Quintel finally see a runway they can land on. But there's a problem.
We're too close, huh? It's going to be too steep, too fast.
Yeah, I know.
Pearson is almost at the runway, but he's much too high above it. If he comes down at a normal descent rate, he'll miss the landing strip. But if he comes down steeply, his plane will gather a dangerous amount of speed. He won't be able to stop before the end of the runway.
The normal approach, we have leading edge and trailing edge flaps, which allow us to slow the airplane down and fly at a slower speed safely. We did not have those flaps as they run off the main hydraulic system.
So what are we gonna do? So we discussed, we had two possibilities. One of them was to do a 360-degree turn and lose the excess of altitude. On the other hand, I thought it would take about 3 minutes, and we were already descending at the rate of 2,500 feet a minute.
Only about 3,000 feet above the ground, the plane doesn't have enough altitude to make a full circle. It would hit the ground before making it back to the landing strip. Pearson chooses a second option.
Well, I guess I'll just slip it.
Pearson decides to try a maneuver called a side slip, practically unheard of on commercial airliners, but sometimes used by glider pilots. And Bob Pearson has a lot of experience flying gliders.
I'm just gonna slip it down till we're almost down at the runway, and I'll straighten it out. Okay.
Side slipping involves what's known as crossing the controls.
Here we go.
Pearson plans to force the aircraft into a sideways freefall, allowing it to drop quickly without increasing its forward airspeed. Pearson has never actually performed a side slip in a glider, but he's attempting one now in a Boeing 767.
The only way that I could control our speed and our descent profile with the runway was to induce drag in the fuselage by cross-controlling the rudder and the elevators on the tail and the ailerons and the wingtips, and cause the aircraft into a crab configuration. Then I could vary that to increase or decrease our speed or increase or decrease our descent rate.
Pearson controls the plane's descent by using his rudders and ailerons to change the angle of the plane. Crossing the controls involves tipping the wings in one direction, but turning the aircraft in the opposite direction, pushing it sideways into the oncoming air. As Flight 143 begins to drop towards the Earth, Quintel is about to discover something he did not expect. The runway he trained at 15 years ago is no longer a runway. Captain Bob Pearson is out of fuel, out of engines, out of options. If he can't line up with the runway at Gimli, he doesn't get a second chance. Pearson turns the yoke left and pushes the rudders to the right. The plane slips to its left.
We're sitting in the center, which is the heart of the airplane where it starts, so it's pretty solid there. I thought there's a real good chance here that we'll be all right. However, when he put the airplane into a side slip, all that went out the window because I figured, oh, if he hits a wing or something and starts to catapult and roll, that's not going to work anymore.
The 767 loses altitude quickly, plowing sideways through the air.
When I looked to the left of the aircraft, I was looking directly at the ground because the airplane is angled quite, well, about maybe 60 degrees of banks. The bank angle was quite high and the nose of the aircraft was quite high. And it was an awkward moment, and if it was awkward for me, I can imagine for the passengers, it must really have felt odd.
I saw a sand trap from this golf course, and I thought, we're going to crash.
Pearson must maintain a crucial balance. He's got to slow the plane enough to be able to land safely. But if he slows down too much, the airliner could lose its lift and plummet to the ground.
When a pilot is normally landing an airplane, he's maneuvering the flight controls and operating the thrust levers pretty continuously on most landings. And so I was doing the same thing without the thrust levers.
This is where I thought of my daughter, Victoria, being alone with my husband and how he was going to cope with our daughter and how she was going to cope without having a mom.
As they approach, Pearson focuses on his target, the threshold of the runway.
I got tunnel vision like I've never had it before. It was just our speed and our relationship with the threshold of the runway.
But now, only hundreds of feet from the ground, Quintel sees that their troubles are far from over. The Gimli landing strip has been converted into a drag racing strip. Today is Saturday, and it's not just a race day. It's a family day on the Gimli strip. Racing is done for the day. But the airfield is filled with members of the local sports car club, camping out with their families for the weekend. Two children have decided to pedal the length of the runway. They don't hear the plane coming for them. Without engines, it's silent. And one thing the 767 doesn't have is a horn.
Brace! Brace for landing!
The nose hit with quite a bang on the runway. Sounded like a shotgun going off at our feet.
The front landing gear gives out immediately. Pearson brakes hard. 2 tires blow out. The bottom of the right engine scrapes the runway.
I was a robot. There was just no emotion at all.
Finally, Pearson sees what's in their path.
And I looked up and I could see 2 boys on bicycles. They must have been probably about 1,000 feet down the runway from our position when I saw them.
And then at one point, I can see he raised his head, and he's surprised. Here's this big aircraft.
I can still remember the look of terror on their faces. So they were close enough for me to see that.
With no nose gear to steer with, Pearson's only hope of driving the plane left or right is by varying the brake pressure on the 2 main landing gear.
That's when my heart started to pitter-patter a little bit.
The kids panic and try to outrun a plane that's traveling about 200 miles an hour.
I knew I couldn't take the airplane into these boys, and I was going to take it off into the grass on the right side. There were campers along the west side of the runway that I didn't notice until after we had touched down, and the nose was on the ground, and I can still remember out the left side, people standing by their barbecues.
Dino Calvert is at the track with his friends for a weekend of racing.
One of the gentlemen in the pits suddenly jumped in his car and he took off. And I thought, well, you don't drive like that in the pits usually. And I looked up and all I could see was smoke rising.
Pearson does all he can to stop the plane in time.
Holy crow!
The plane plows into a guardrail installed down the middle of the runway.
Smoke, Bob.
"17 minutes after running out of fuel, Air Canada Flight 143 comes to a final stop on the ground.
Yeah? You okay?
Somebody yelled, "Yahoo!" or something, and then people started applauding. And we were so grateful. We made it. When you believe that you're going to crash, you do believe that the airplane is going to break apart, you're going to have fire.
Evacuate! Evacuate!
Evacuate!
All right, let's go. We got to get up. Thick smoke is quickly filling the cabin. The crew doesn't take any chances. They want everyone off the plane as quickly as possible.
There was a sense of joy, and then a panic, kind of. It seemed to go in waves, and then a panic saying, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here.
Less than 2 months earlier, an Air Canada DC-9 made a successful emergency landing in Cincinnati, only to burst into flames on the tarmac before all the passengers could get off. 23 people died. The crew and passengers of this flight want to avoid a similar fate.
It took maybe just a few seconds to come up to a full halt on the runway, but the cockpit was full of smoke.
Passenger evacuation checklist.
Passenger checklist.
Fuel shut off.
Off.
Cabin depressurized.
Electrics off.
Electrics off.
Checklist complete.
Time to get out of here.
Come on, guys, get some fire extinguishers.
We grabbed the fire extinguishers on our way, and you never go to a fire at a racetrack without having a fire extinguisher with you. And we ran up towards it. The doors open up, and you see the chutes come out, sort of like a spider growing legs.
The plane ended up eventually standing almost what appeared to me to be almost on its nose.
When I opened my door and I saw that the chute was so steep, I thought, oh my goodness, how to get these passengers to go down?
Due to the nose-down angle of the plane, the two rear slides don't reach the ground. 10 people are slightly injured during the evacuation, most of them coming down the steep rear slides.
I heard on the west radar frequency, he said, one of the 767 says, he's down okay, he's in one piece, and that's when our cheer went up. I said, okay, because all of these people were going to sleep in their own bed that night.
There's still a lot of smoke coming from the plane's nose.
Turned out it was about 6 inches of insulation between the inner and outer skins. From friction, that was starting to burn.
The flight attendants have good news. All 61 passengers have made it off the plane. There's not so much as a single serious injury.
Come on, give me a hand. Yeah, extinguisher.
Bob Pearson has done what no one has done before. He's safely landed a 767 with no engines, gliding to safety for more than 26,000 feet.
Air Canada Flight 143 glided...
The event makes international headlines immediately. People are already asking how one of the most sophisticated passenger planes in the world could have run out of fuel.
Sliding down emergency chutes.
By the next day, the investigation has already begun. Bill Taylor and Diane Rochelot of Canada's Aviation Safety Bureau are among the first investigators at the scene.
I was a junior mechanical engineering at the time. I had been working for Transport Canada for a year. Going to the field for the first time was very exciting. It was new. It was a major aircraft.
Once we got into the fuel quantity indicating system, I actually left Diane to deal with the specifics of the computer system.
First, Bill Taylor needs to confirm what everyone has been telling him, that the plane is out of fuel. Investigators drained the tanks, collecting less than 17 gallons of fuel. The 767 can hold almost 24,000 gallons. It's like having 5 tablespoons of fuel in a mid-sized car. Taylor next needs to examine the possibility that the fuel leaked out during the flight.
The other checks involved looking for any evidence of fuel having been lost. I even went so far as to go into what they call the dry bay of the aircraft. I'm a bit claustrophobic, so I really wasn't too enthused about going up in there, but I crawled up and had a look around with the flashlight and confirmed that there was no evidence of fuel having been lost in there.
That leaves Taylor with only one conclusion. Flight 143 took off without enough fuel. Now investigators need to find out why.
It's in one piece.
Diane Rochelot begins looking for the answer to that question in the plane's sophisticated electronics bay, located beneath the cabin.
The 767 was a newer type aircraft, and it did have a lot of computerized system, and I guess back in 1982, these were coming onto the market at a fast rate, and they were newer types of electronic system.
Rochelot confirms that a computerized unit, the digital fuel gauge processor, had been malfunctioning on this plane. There was no spare in Montreal, so it couldn't be replaced. Rochelot takes the component for testing.
It was decided early on that the unit, the fuel processing unit, would be taken to the manufacturer, Honeywell, in Indianapolis for testing. And I was tasked with taking the unit. So we went through all the testing procedure. And then at one point, we did discover that there was a malfunction with the unit. During the testing, we went more and more in depth, and we found out that one of the circuit, it's called an inductor coil. It was a very, very small part, and it was encapsulated at manufacture, and encapsulated means it's covered with plastic. You cannot visually see it because it's now covered with plastic, and you can't see the inductor coil itself. But once we took over the plastic case, we could see that the solder joint had not been made properly. which caused a malfunction in the system.
The faulty processor explains why Pearson didn't have fuel gauges for the flight, but doesn't explain why he didn't have enough fuel. The inoperative gauges were clearly flagged. Ground crews wouldn't have relied on them when they were fueling the plane. Investigators confirmed that the ground crew did perform a manual check of the fuel before takeoff.
We just need to know what you did next.
Yeah? We did a manual check of both tanks, and then we pump enough fuel for the trip to Edmonton.
Flight 143 should have taken off with enough fuel for the trip.
Okay, thanks. That helps.
Investigators now have to figure out how one of the world's most advanced jetliners took off with half the fuel necessary for its flight. The investigators know that with its fuel gauges out of service, Flight 143's fuel tanks were checked manually. Then the fuel for the trip to Edmonton was added to the tanks. But before the plane could be given more fuel, a crucial calculation had to be carried out. Pilots need to know the weight of the fuel on their plane. But fuel trucks pump jet fuel by volume. In order for pilots and fuelers to communicate, a simple routine translation between volume and weight has to be made.
Thank you.
Investigators check and double-check that math. The fueling records from the day of the accident provide the answers they've been looking for.
This is a typical fueling record.
But when investigators examine the calculations for Flight 143,
and this is from Flight 143.
They look anything but straightforward. The document clearly shows the amount of fuel in the right and left tanks, but investigators are troubled by two particular numbers. One converts volume to kilograms, the other converts it to pounds.
He shouldn't have been using both. So did you convert to pounds or to kilograms?
To pound? Oh, to kilo. Can I see that again?
Further interviews with the technicians and crew reveal that the events on Flight 143
Now I don't know what I did.
Were caused by human error involving poor calculations and ultimately inadequate training.
Okay, fellas, we've finished with the fuel.
The technicians refueling Flight 143 got muddled in their calculations while converting the volume coming out of the fuel truck to the weight of the fuel in the plane's tanks. No one who saw the calculations that day noticed the basic error. In 1983, Canadian ground crews were used to converting the amount of fuel leaving their trucks into pounds. The 767 was the first plane in Air Canada's fleet to have metric fuel gauges. Its fuel should have been measured not in pounds, but in kilograms, which requires a different calculation. Flight 143 needed 22,300 kilograms of fuel for the trip. But pilots and technicians let it leave with 22,300 pounds instead. Because a pound is about half a kilogram, the plane only got half the fuel it required, which explains why Pearson's flight computer told him he had plenty of fuel. He entered the wrong amount of fuel to start with. In the past, the flight engineer calculated the fuel loads. This accident raised an important question. Whose job was it with the two-man crew?
Better training is definitely an issue in an incident such as that. If everyone is trained and the lines are drawn as to who's responsible for what, then there's no ambiguity on it. People know what they're responsible for. In this case, it was sort of open-ended. We weren't aware who was responsible for the final say on this field stuff.
A subsequent inquiry found that none of those involved that day was trained in metric calculations. Not the ground technicians, not the pilots.
I had not received any, neither of us had received any training at all on doing these calculations.
The computer that had replaced the 767's flight engineer was broken, and no one knew who should be doing its job. Air Canada 143 was essentially down a man.
And the goal is to prevent a recurrence of this particular event. And also, we also find out other systems that might have been either at fault or maybe they could cause a problem in the future, and you do try to prevent recurrence.
All right.
It took a string of mechanical and human failures for Flight 143 to run out of fuel. But another failure that day may have saved some lives. If the plane's nose gear had not collapsed, it would have taken Pearson much longer to stop. The plane could have slid into the people who were at the strip that day, which would have had catastrophic results. There could have been more injuries or even loss of life. Pearson and Quintel were partly blamed for their roles in the incident. A government inquiry recommended that Air Canada re-evaluate the training of flight crews and ground technicians in metric fuel conversions. It also recommended that the airline keep more spare parts, such as fuel gauge processors. Rick Dion retired in 2003 after a long career as Air Canada's coordinator of maintenance control. First Officer Maurice Quintel was promoted to captain in 1989. Captain Bob Pearson went on to fly 10 more years for Air Canada, his experience at Gimli shaping the rest of his career as a commercial pilot.
This experience affected me mostly by making me more relaxed as a pilot, giving me the feeling that as much as I've trained for all those years, that there's always that question about how you're going to perform when the chips are down, and I now have the feeling that no matter what, as long as an aircraft stayed together, I would get it safely back on the ground. And so it's been a relaxing experience.
It's the knowledge that you know under stress you can perform. Before that, you don't know. You just hope you will, and you train for it, but you never know.
With the things that they had to deal with was magnificent. I think that got proven in the simulator in Vancouver. They tried out this same circumstances with several crews, and they all crashed.
Probably the most important thing that came out of it was a realization that when something new is introduced, special attention and training needs to be accomplished for people to be aware what they're dealing with.
When we had landed and the airplane was all in one piece, I thought, wow, I got another chance to fly again.
Because of a tragedy like that, once you take your deck of cards and fire it in the air, you're truly free. And I guess from that point of view, Gimli I find it very difficult to say, but Gimli was maybe almost the best thing that ever happened to me, next to meeting my wonderful wife and marrying her.
2 days after the landing at Gimli, Air Canada's 767 was back in the air on its way to Winnipeg for repairs. A quarter century later, that same plane is still in service, and it still carries the nickname that Bob Pearson earned it, the Gimli Glider.
down and turn to your right. If you force it, you'll break it. This won't come out, Bob.
Push the switch forward.
A single light bulb is preventing a modern jetliner from landing.
Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
Struggling to fix a minor problem, a much more serious one develops.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
The plane crashes in a remote swamp. Those who survived the crash face a new danger. The swamp has filled with jet fuel.
No one light a match!
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation history.
The crash would point investigators to an astonishing danger lurking in all commercial cockpits. December 29th, 1972, the dawn of the jumbo jet era. On its way to Florida, this L-1011 TriStar is the most advanced passenger jet in the world.
The Lucky TriStar was a fascinating bird. It was a beautifully flying airplane. It had a tremendous amount of power and a lot of innovation to it.
The cabin of this Eastern Airlines jet is large and quiet. The service is first-rate. Bob Loft is the captain for Eastern Airlines Flight 401. He's been with the airline for more than 30 years. His first officer is Albert Stockstill. His second officer is Donald Repo. The jet has left the bitter cold of New York behind and is now descending towards Miami.
Welcome to Miami. The temperature's in the low 70s, and it's a beautiful night out there tonight. Go ahead and throw them out.
Angelo Donadeo is an off-duty Eastern Airlines maintenance expert. He's catching a ride back to Miami. There are 176 people on board tonight's flight. Most are heading south for New Year's. Ron and Lily Infantino have been married for only 20 days. They've just spent Christmas with his family.
The seatbelt sign came on as normal. We're in a final approach. I look out the window there and I could see lights at the airport.
Close to midnight, the plane begins its approach to Miami International Airport. Stockstill flies the plane, while Repo performs a landing checklist.
Radar. Up, off. Hydraulic panels checked. 35, 33. Gear down.
The captain notices a problem.
Bird, is that handling?
No nose gear.
The light showing that the nose gear is locked hasn't lit up.
I'm gonna raise it back up.
The gear might not be all the way down. Loft tries again. The sound of the landing gear echoes through the plane.
It makes a pretty loud grinding noise. If you've flown very much, you're familiar with that sound. So they did that several times. The pilots did that several times, and we weren't alarmed. It's just one of those things that happens sometimes, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, great, we're gonna be late getting home.
Still no light. Loft isn't sure if his front landing gear is locked. If it isn't, landing could be disastrous.
Tower, this is Eastern 401. Looks like we're gonna have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet.
Eastern 401 Heavy, roger. Pull up, climb straight ahead to 2000. Go back to approach control, 128.6.
You want me to test the lights or not?
Yeah, check it.
Flight engineer Repo performs a test nicknamed the Christmas tree. It lights up every warning light in the cockpit to see if the bulbs are working. The nose gear indicator light fails the test. The bulb is probably burnt out. But there's a slim chance of a double failure. Both the light bulb and the landing gear could be broken.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
But the troublesome bulb is out of the captain's reach. On the ground, air traffic control directs Flight 401 to climb to 2,000 feet and circle away from the airport until the problem is solved.
You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
It's right above that red one, isn't
Yeah,
it?
I can't get at it from here.
Wow. Yeah, I can't make a pull out either.
It's a moonless night. As the plane veers away from Miami, there's total darkness outside.
All of a sudden, it turned pitch dark again. And that means we were going back out west towards the Everglades.
Co-pilot Stockstill is flying the plane, but Captain Loft needs his help to solve the problem.
Put the autopilot on here.
The TriStar is equipped with the most sophisticated autopilot in history. It actually has the ability to land the plane on its own. Stockstill programs it to fly at 2,000 feet.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
The light is finally removed. Richard Pragluski is an aviation engineer. He takes this flight regularly and can tell that the plane is experiencing technical problems.
He was heading out towards the Everglades. I knew there was something wrong with the plane because if you have a delay, they'll circle the plane.
The irritating problem isn't getting better. Now Stockstill can't get the light back in.
Now, push the switch just forward. Okay. You got it sideways then.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 300.
Okay, 300, Eastern 401. Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
The electronics bay on the plane is underneath the cockpit. The room, nicknamed the Hellhole, is a unique feature on wide-bodied jets. The front landing gear mechanism can be seen from there.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this?
Hold down and turn to your right.
Anything I can do it with?
Turn to your left one time.
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob. If I had a pair of pliers, I could cushion it with that
I
Kleenex.
can give you a pair of pliers, but if you force it, you'll break it. Just believe me.
To hell with it, to hell with this! Get down and see if we're lined up with that red line, that's all we care. Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
As the crew struggles to fix the problem. In the cabin, Richard Pragluski sees something peculiar out of his window.
I could see a tower to my right in the distance, and it looked like we were going into a glide path, which I found very strange.
Pragluski has noticed something the pilots haven't. The plane is getting closer and closer to the swamp below. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is flying over the Florida Everglades. Below it, nothing but a dark, deserted swamp. To passenger Richard Pragluski, something doesn't seem right.
I felt it kind of strange that they hadn't made any announcements. But again, he was still fairly high off the ground. And I figured they would come out and tell us that when they were going to make the landing. So I wasn't overly concerned.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Looks square to me.
Can't you get the hole lined up?
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there. It's always something. We could have made scheduled.
Without a green light, they still don't know if their landing gear is locked. Flight engineer Don Repo is now in the belly of the plane. There's a viewing window in the hellhole which should let him see if the front wheels are locked in place.
I
don't see it down there.
Huh?
I don't see it.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it. It's pitch dark, and I throw the little light and get nothing.
Wheel well lights on?
Pardon?
Wheel well lights on?
Captain Loft has forgotten to turn on lights outside the plane that illuminate the landing gear.
Now try it.
United 737, turn right in 010.
At Miami International, controller Charlie Johnson has just finished dealing with another troubled jet.
National 607 has landed without incident.
Fire trucks were deployed, but they weren't used.
He notices that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 seems to have dropped from 2,000 feet to 900. But he's not overly concerned. It's not unusual to get false readings for several radar sweeps in a row.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Captain Loft believes that he'll soon get confirmation that his gear is locked. He wants to return to the airport.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
The plane is heading west, away from the airport. It will take several minutes to get lined up for the landing. Deep in the Everglades, Bob Marcus is hunting frogs with a friend. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 roars past.
I just saw the lights blinking across the sky, and it was so black. There's no horizon in the west, and you could tell how high the plane was.
Suddenly, the pilots make an alarming observation.
We did something to the altitude?
What?
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
I see the lights in the cabin just flickering on and off, and I heard a noise. It was a violent whipping sensation. Then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose.
Charlie Johnson notices that Flight 401's altitude now reads as coastal, or sea level.
Eastern 401, I've lost you on the radar there, your transponder. What's your altitude now?
There's no response from Eastern 401. Another plane makes a disturbing report.
Miami approaches this National 611. We just saw a big flash. Looked like it came out west. Don't know what it means, but wanted to let you know.
In a dark, remote swamp, those who survived the crash find themselves in a nightmare. Bob Marcus races towards the site of the crash.
Oh, I was going as fast as I could. It took me about 15 minutes, I think, to get to the crash site.
Remarkably, Richard Pregluski is alive.
I knew I was badly injured because I could see my clothes hanging from my body. I had almost no clothes on the upper half of the body, and I could see skin coming down my arms. And I also knew that when you're in shock, you feel no pain. So I knew I really was seriously injured, and I started thinking, I said, well, you know, the pain will come later, but how do I keep calm and get out of there, because the longer I'm in that swamp, and the condition I'm in, the more danger I'm in.
When the plane plane crashed, a huge fireball tore through the cabin.
I remember that fire coming to my face. I remember the flash. I remember that I tried breathing and I could not get my breath. Of course, the fire took all the oxygen out of the air. And that's the last thing I remember until I got up in the swamp itself.
Ron Infantino was knocked out by the crash. He wakes up in the swamp.
So I was thrown quite a bit. And I was away from Verizon or everybody else. Nobody was even near me. Lily. Lily.
He's badly wounded. His new wife, Lily, was sitting next to him, but now she's nowhere to be seen. Swamp water doused the initial flames. But 20,000 kilograms of jet fuel has now leaked into the swamp. A single spark could start a deadly blaze.
No one light a match! We're covered in jet fuel!
What a sad thing to come through that crash and then have somebody do something stupid like strike a match and have us all just blow up. That was the real fear.
Hoping to help the survivors, Bob Marcus jumps into the swamp. He immediately feels the sting of the jet fuel on his skin.
It burnt my legs. I had to treat my legs for burns for about a week.
Marcus quickly spots a survivor who's in grave danger. The badly wounded man is still strapped to his seat. He's on the verge of drowning.
And his head kept dropping down in the water. He came up, he said, "Help me. I can't hold my head up much longer," and then dropped back down in the water. So I helped him, I pulled him up.
Don't worry, I got you. I got you.
Bob Marcus saves dozens of lives, preventing many people from drowning. Isolated from the other survivors and unable to move, Ron Infantino now has a new reason to fear for his life.
After a while, the alligators and the snakes, you could hear them in the weeds coming by, and you could hear the croaking of the alligators because they started to come back to their natural habitat. And as far as I'm concerned, if a gator came up to me or a snake, I was dead meat because I couldn't defend myself at all. And then I heard Christmas caroling.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
To rally the survivors' spirits, Trudy Smith and others sing Christmas carols.
We knew instinctively that we weren't going to get out of there in a hurry because nobody knew where we were. In the middle of the swamp, midnight. So what else are you going to do?
And you got to picture us this, I mean, in the dark at night, or you hear us singing in the wilderness. It was like you're on the Titanic going down type of thing, you know? It was unbelievable.
Within minutes, Coast Guard helicopters are sent out in search of the crash site. But in the pitch black night, they can't find the wreckage. Bob Marcus tries to signal the distant helicopters.
But I could see where they were, and they were going the wrong direction. And I just waved the light at them until I saw them turn and head back towards us.
It seemed like we'd been in the swamps for a really long time when we heard a helicopter, and it was such a welcoming sound because that means somebody knows that you're there.
Less than half an hour after the crash, the Coast Guard arrives. nearest landing site is 100 meters away. Marcus rushes to meet the helicopter and ferry the rescuers back to the crash site. His first passenger is rescue worker Don Schneck.
I made it to the airboat. He asked me, where are all the rescuers? And I said, this is it, let's go. He took us out into the glades to a point where he said, this is as far as I want to go because I don't want to run anybody over. And he said, there are bodies out here all over the place.
Don Schneck starts searching for survivors.
I approached the large object that I had seen at a small distance and realized it was the nose section of the aircraft.
He's amazed to discover that Captain Bob Loft has survived the crash.
He was in bad shape. He had lacerations, so I knew he had broken ribs. I could tell he was in shock, so I calmed him down, told him, I'm the only one here right now, but they're coming. Just hang in there. I'm going to die. He told me that, and I argued with him. Anything to keep anything going. It just made me feel so inadequate because it was just me. I turned around and I looked back towards Miami and thinking, where in the heck is everybody? And at that time when I looked, I must have seen 50 lights coming. And I went, thank God.
First Officer Bert Stockstill was killed during the crash. Captain Bob Loft soon dies at the scene. Angelo Donadeo and Don Repo have survived and are taken to hospital. In all, 77 people survived the crash. 99 people are killed. By dawn, all the wounded have been transported to Miami hospitals. Ron Infantino is one of the many who are struggling to survive.
Priest comes over and does the last rites. So right then I knew I was in bad shape. And it's a scary thought. And of course at that time I'm still asking for Lily, you know, had they seen her? It was such a madhouse there that night, you could imagine.
Lily. Where's Lily?
The crash is headline news around the world. It's the first ever jumbo jet to crash, and it produces the largest number of deaths in US civil aviation history. There's tremendous pressure on investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board to find out what happened.
It was an enormous puzzle because this was the newest, the most sophisticated, the best of the airliners. It apparently was in perfect working condition. So the NTSB perceived that this was going to be a very long investigation that involved multi-level potential problems.
The crash site itself is an important clue for investigators arriving at the scene. The trail of debris is enormously long. That suggests that the plane hit the swamp almost in the same nose-up position as it would while landing at an airport. Its descent was clearly slow and gradual. NTSB investigators have documented the final settings for many of the instruments in the cockpit. They discover that the autopilot was set to maintain an altitude of 2,000 feet. So why didn't it? Maintenance expert Angelo Donadeo is interviewed. All he can tell investigators is the crew was trying to fix a light bulb before the crash. Within days, the plane's 2 black boxes are recovered. Investigators hope they will provide some answers. Before they can extract the data, flight engineer Don Repo dies in hospital. Ron Infantino is given some devastating news of his own. The body of his wife Lily has been found under the plane's wing.
She was just a wonderful person. I was 27 years old, and she was the same age, and it was actually my first love.
Infantino is haunted by the memory of switching seats with Lily just before the crash.
They had swapped seats quite casually earlier during the flight when she had gotten up to go to the restroom. She was thrown into the swamp and drowned, and he lived.
The swamp proves both a blessing and a curse for survivors.
That's what saved most of the lives, actually. Because the plane broke up, it absorbed all the energy. And the mud absorbed it, and the plane just dispersed.
The swamp water is so thick with mud, it also clogs survivors' wounds, preventing many from bleeding to death. But there's a deadly new threat facing some survivors. Their wounds have become infected, contaminated by a deadly organism found in the black mud of the Everglades. The organism produces an infection called gas gangrene. It can kill a person in just 2 days. Gas gangrene can only be destroyed in a hyperbaric chamber. It's a pressurized container that gets filled with high levels of oxygen. The oxygen gets forced into the wounds and kills the bacteria. 8 of the surviving passengers are infected with gas gangrene. Hyperbaric chambers must be found for all of them. The only other way to save patients is to amputate the infected limb. Ron Infantino's arm is badly infected.
Doctor came in and says, well, we've diagnosed it as gas gangrene. He says, we got to take your arm off immediately, or I have to get you to a hyperbaric chamber. Unfortunately, he says, the only hyperbaric chamber is at Mercy Hospital, and that's all been taken advantage of.
Unless doctors can find a chamber soon, Infantino will lose his arm. While doctors search for a chamber for Ron Infantino, investigators examine what's left of the plane. They test its flight controls, engines, instruments, and its electrical and hydraulic systems.
The plane was virtually new. It was in perfect condition. There was no mechanical reason found that would have caused the crash.
In fact, some parts of the plane are in such good condition that the NTSB gives them back to Eastern Airlines so they can be installed on other airplanes in its fleet. An unused hyperbaric chamber is finally found for Ron Infantino at a Navy base in Panama City. He spends 40 hours in the chamber. The pressurized oxygen kills the bacteria and saves his life.
Gentlemen, we have 3 causes of the crash to explore.
A state-of-the-art jetliner plunged 2,000 feet without the crew noticing. Investigators know the plane was mechanically sound. They now focus on other possible reasons for the unobserved descent. At the top of the list is subtle incapacitation of the pilot. The autopsy of Captain Bob Loft has yielded a gruesome discovery. Captain Loft had a large, undetected tumor growing in his brain. It pressed into the part of his brain responsible for sight. Medical records reveal that between the ages of 50 and 52, vision in the pilot's left eye had rapidly deteriorated. Doctors believe that the captain may have had reduced peripheral vision. The tumor could have created blind spots. As his attention became focused on the malfunctioning light, he may not have noticed dire warnings on his altimeter. investigators consider a stunning possibility. An undetected medical ailment may have contributed to the world's first jumbo jet disaster.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
Investigators learn what they can about Captain Bob Loft. They interview people who knew him and pore over his medical records.
The investigators heard that Captain Loft, so far as his family and friends knew, had perfect vision. He was an expert marksman. He shot doves, particularly, which are a very small target.
Loft's records show that he'd recently passed a medical in which he was issued corrective glasses for flying. But the evidence doesn't support the notion that his vision was dangerously impaired.
He was 55 years old, and who gets to be 55 without wearing reading glasses? Not many. Dr. Joe Davis, who did the autopsy, told me that even though the tumor was pressing on areas of his brain that control vision, there was no reason to think that it had yet begun to affect those. He felt it had nothing to do with the accident.
Investigators still don't know why Flight 401 started descending in the first place.
Put the autopilot on here.
Could the autopilot, which was supposed to keep the plane at 2,000 feet, have malfunctioned? The plane's computers survived the crash. They're removed and examined. 11 days after the crash, the autopilot computers are installed on another TriStar. It flies the same route as Flight 401. The autopilot holds that plane at 2,000 feet. So why hadn't it on the night of the accident? Investigators will need to explore other leads to find out. There's another question that dogs this investigation. Why didn't the Miami Tower alert the crew that their plane was dropping? The world's first three-dimensional radar had recently been installed there. It meant that controller Charlie Johnson knew the location, altitude, and speed of Flight 401.
National 607 is declaring
Investigators study recordings of Johnson's
Runway 9
conversations.
will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
And discover that on the night of the crash, it was another plane that demanded most of his attention. National Airlines Flight 607 was coming into land just ahead of Flight 401. That flight was having its
National
own
607
landing
is
gear
declaring an
problems.
emergency. Runway 9 will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
As he focused on the emergency, Johnson handed Flight 401 over to another controller. But just as National 607 came in for its emergency landing, the other controller phoned Johnson and handed Flight 401 back to him.
Eastern Heavy's coming back to you. Unsafe nose gear.
No.
At the time, Flight 401 was already over the swamp. Johnson had 5 other planes to monitor. He was also dealing with the aftermath of his emergency landing.
National 607 has landed without incident. Trucks were deployed,
That's when he
but
noticed
they
that
weren't
Flight
used.
401's altitude had dropped to 900 feet.
The way the radars work, still to a certain extent this happens, but back then it was even worse. Coast mode was a very well-known phenomenon. I mean, you might lose the target for 2 or 3 minutes in terms of the altitude reporting part of it, and it goes and gives you some weird altitude, and then boom, it's right back where it should be. But the controller didn't stop there, and this was really to his credit.
Johnson decided to make contact with Flight 401.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
After that brief exchange, Johnson assumed there was no problem.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay,
Investigators conclude that at that moment, Controller Johnson was the only one who could see that the plane was losing altitude. Why hadn't he passed that information along to the crew? US government regulations for air traffic controllers provide the answer. It simply wasn't part of a controller's job.
At the time of the crash, the FAA required approach controllers to maintain a separation of the airplanes. It did not give them a duty to maintain the altitude of the airliner with regard to the ground.
Now investigators try to determine how the plane's own warning system failed to alert pilots to their growing danger. The L-1011 is equipped with an alarm that sounds if the plane goes 250 feet above or below the altitude selected by the pilots. As investigators replay the tape from the black box, they clearly hear that alarm sounding in the cockpit as the plane passed through 1,750 feet.
Did you hear that? How did they miss it?
Investigators closely examine the cockpit transcript to try to understand how the alarm was missed.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Swear to me.
Investigators noticed that just before the alarm sounded in the cockpit, warning the crew that the plane is too low, both pilots were completely absorbed with the landing gear light. The conversation also tells investigators that the flight engineer was below in the hellhole. The warning chime came out of a speaker at his workstation. Investigators begin to realize that the two pilots were unable to hear a perfectly audible alarm because they were focused so entirely on solving another problem.
That chime, which is clearly heard on the cockpit voice recorder, was not registering in the minds of all the men on that flight deck. Not because they weren't trying to pay attention, but because they were tunneled in on this one problem. That's what we do as humans.
Investigators now focus on crew distraction as a likely cause of this accident. Several instruments would have displayed the decreasing altitude.
The major question was, why were the pilots so preoccupied that they were not looking at the instrument panel?
They had to look at the human beings. They had to look at the interaction. They had to look at why no one was paying attention to the airplane as it began to creep out of 2,000 feet. That was scary territory in 1972.
Investigators interview a number of pilots and make a startling discovery. Pilots admitted that they placed a lot of trust in the modern new autopilots flying their planes. They may have become overly dependent on the technology.
Put the autopilot on here.
Investigators suspect that the Eastern crew was so confident in their autopilot that they didn't monitor their instruments as closely as they should have.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
Once the autopilot was on, none of the pilots paid attention to actually flying the plane.
Still got to find out why that plane went down.
Investigators still haven't determined the most crucial piece of information. If the autopilot was working, why did the plane dive into the swamp?
We did something to the altitude? What?
The pilot's conversation clearly shows that they hadn't deliberately started descending.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
So why did it happen? The answer comes in a dramatic form when the NTSB conducts a public hearing in Miami 2 months after the crash. Before the hearing, an Eastern Airlines pilot named Daniel Gellert wrote the chairman of the NTSB offering to testify on his own behalf. He had flown the TriStar L-1011 and noticed some abnormalities.
The world of airline piloting in 1972 was hostile to a pilot going around his chief pilot and his airline and raising his hand to the NTSB and saying, hey, wait a minute, I've had an experience too, because airlines were far more insular than they are today.
Gellert tells the hearing that during a recent flight on a TriStar, he had accidentally dropped a map on the cockpit floor. As he bent down to pick it up, he nudged his control column. He noticed immediately that the plane's autopilot had been affected. The part of the autopilot controlling altitude had been turned off. The NTSB discovers that Gellert's experience is shared by others. In fact, 17 days after the accident, Eastern Airlines tacked a notice onto a company bulletin board and also mailed it to all of its TriStar pilots. The bulletin warned against accidentally bumping the control wheel.
One of the things that we built into all the modern jetliners and airliners is simply a pressure switch. So if you need to take over right now, you don't want to be wasting time down here on the panel turning the autopilot off. You just grab it and the autopilot goes away.
The flight data recorder tells investigators the precise moment that the plane's altitude started to drop. It was 11:37 and 8 seconds. By studying the voice recorder transcript, investigators can tell what was happening in the cockpit at that exact time.
Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
By turning to speak to the flight engineer, investigators believe that Captain Loft bumped his control wheel. He did it with just enough pressure to disengage that part of the autopilot that had been controlling the plane's altitude. Without anyone realizing it, a simple nudge of the control wheel started a gradual descent. On a dark, moonless night, the pilots had no visual cues to tell them they were falling.
It was determined that occasionally, with just a soft bump, an autopilot had been disengaged.
So before the crash, it wasn't part of the training?
A training director for Eastern Airlines eventually reveals that before the Everglades crash, pilots were never taught that a bump could disengage the autopilot. The NTSB comes to a sobering conclusion. The plane crash was due to pilot error. The crew was distracted. They mishandled the plane's sophisticated automation, and they hadn't been properly trained.
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation safety history, and we really didn't know this for about 10 or 15 years in terms of the true import of what it did to us in focusing our attention on the fact that the way we handle things in a cockpit was not only not correct, but it was dangerous.
Investigators also make a disheartening find. When the nose gear indicator light assembly is examined, they discover that a light bulb inside is burnt out.
Go ahead and throw them out.
Flight 401's landing gear was locked. The plane could have landed. The only piece of the plane that failed was a $12 light bulb. The full legacy of Flight 401 will take years to unfold. It will ultimately alter how pilots are trained and how accidents are investigated. But first, the tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 will take a very bizarre twist. As far as the NTSB is concerned, the investigation into Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is over. Several recommendations were laid out to prevent similar accidents. Those include new regulations instructing air traffic controllers to warn pilots when they're getting too close to the ground. But 4 years later, it became clear there was a bigger lesson to be learned from Eastern Airlines Flight 401. In 1977, two 747s collided on a runway in Tenerife on the Canary Islands. It was the deadliest plane crash of all time.
And we're now at takeoff. Okay, stand by for takeoff, I will call you. 1736, report when runway clear.
That accident was caused by a string of miscommunications in the cockpit.
Is he not your off now? Is he not your off? They're on American.
Investigators established that 70% of crashes were due to pilot error.
Both of these accidents, Tenerife and 401, what you see is crews dedicated to doing a good job, but not realizing that they're human, not realizing how many things can go wrong if you don't appreciate how human beings fail.
By the late 1970s, NASA began to explore a new behavioral science designed to reduce pilot error.
And pilots be on the lookout for any different from behavior when we acquire.
It's called Crew Resource Management, or CRM.
Crew resource management simply means that we're not going to have one pilot leading and everybody else following. It means that the captain has to be a leader and listen to and interact with his subordinate crew members, and the subordinate crew members have to speak up.
Decades later, Flight 401 is taught in aviation courses around the world as a textbook example of poor CRM.
The problem was that we did not teach Bob Loft or Stockstill or any of these folks at the time that when something goes wrong, the commander's first responsibility is to maintain aircraft control and either do it himself or assign somebody.
We're up to 2,000. You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
On Flight 401, Captain Loft did not clarify who should be doing what. Instead, all 3 crew members worked on the same problem.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
It's gotta come out a little bit and then snap in.
With the co-pilot flying, the captain commanding from the left seat, you already had cross purposes here.
It's right above that red one, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't get at it from here.
And you had a light quadrant the captain couldn't quite reach, and the co-pilot could, but the co-pilot is flying the airplane. You've just set them up for a major problem, and guess what? Systemically, we never taught them what to do.
Today, CRM also trains flight crews not to be intimidated by one crew member's mood.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do it with?
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob.
So if the leader is having a problem, in this case with a light bulb,
Okay. You got it sideways now.
and he's really irritated at it, and the co-pilot has now made the problem worse. The co-pilot's not going to be happy with himself over that.
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there.
Don Repo is not going to be happy that he got downstairs to try to solve the problem, and he couldn't see anything, and he's got to come up and report that.
I don't see it.
They're all tense.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it.
And when you get a crew like that tense, it's not to turn around to the captain and say, you shouldn't have done that. But this is part of the evolution of what air safety has now learned and been able to teach so many other industries.
The enduring legacy of Flight 401 is the delegation of specific tasks in the cockpit. The result is fewer crashes. There was also much more bizarre fallout from this crash. It seemed that the crew of Flight 401 was haunting other Eastern Airlines flights. For some time after the crash, flight crews and passengers report seeing lifelike apparitions of Flight 401's crew. Many of the ghost sightings were on aircraft fitted with recovered parts from Flight 401. The ghost stories spread quickly. One book devoted entirely to those stories suggests that the ghosts were there to protect passengers and crew from further mishap.
The official reaction at Eastern Airlines to these ghost stories was one of absolute eye-rolling denial in public, and in private, a certain bit of panic.
There are so many ghost sightings that eventually Eastern Airlines removes Flight 401's cannibalized plane parts from all other aircraft. None of those who survived the crash will ever forget the horror they witnessed in the Everglades that night. And 35 years after their ordeal, many of them returned to that swamp to finally recognize the heroic efforts of Bob Marcus.
Oh my God, they have found us!
We're here today to recognize and to say thank you.
Many of the ones who lived because Robert Marcus was there with his airboat. He saw them drowning and decided that the thing that he could do would be to save the ones he could save. Robert Marcus was the kind of person that I hope that all of us ultimately would be if we were confronted with that sort of thing, but he drew on some special courage to do what he did. He was one of the true heroes of the crash.